In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add a dialog to your application. So just like always, we start with app module. And here we import md dialog module. Okay. Now let's go to our app template. Here I want to add a button. And when the user clicks this button, we're going to open a dialog. So button. I'm also going to apply md raised button directive. And let's call this open dialog. Now let's handle the click event. So click, I want to bind this to the open dialog method in our component. So let's go to app component.ts. Here I'm going to add the open dialog method. Now how can we open a dialog? It's very easy. First of all, let's imagine this dialog is for editing a course. So somewhere in our application, we need to have a component for editing a course. We can display that component in the router outlet as a web page, or we can display it inside a dialog. How we display it doesn't matter, but we need a component to start with. So I'm going to generate a new component here. Let's call this edit-course. All right, so we have a new component. Now, in order to display this component inside a dialog, first we need to inject the md dialog service in our app component. So here in app component, I'm going to add a constructor. Here we inject an md dialog object. This is a service defined in the md dialog module that we use for opening dialogs. So let's import this from Angular/material. Okay. Now here in the open dialog method, we can simply call this the dialog.open, and as the first argument, we specify the target component, that is edit course component. That's all we have to do. Very easy. Let's have a look. Back in the browser, here's our button. Click. Okay, we got this overlay and it looks like there's a dialog on the left side of the screen, but it looks like something is not working. So let's take a look at the console. We got this error here. No component factory found for edit course component. What does this mean? Well, earlier in the course, in the section about deployment, I told you about the compilation step that happens when an Angular application starts. So you know that Angular compiler kicks in, it's going to walk down the tree of our components, and then it will compile each component in this tree. But where does this tree come from? Well, it starts from index.html. So here we have the root component, that is app root. So then Angular compiler is going to look at the template for app root, that is our app.component.html. So here we don't have any references to any other components in this application. In other words, the only component in the component tree is our app component, even though we created this edit course component, but it's not in the component tree. So Angular compiler cannot find it, it cannot compile it, and that's why we got that error. Also, in that section about deployment, I showed you what happens when Angular compiler compiles a component. For each component, it generates an ng factory file. Remember? So that's why we get this error. No component factory found for edit course component. So the reason this happened is because we are adding this edit course component dynamically in the DOM. It's not hard-coded anywhere in our templates. To solve this problem, we need to register this component as an entry component. So here in app module, inside this ng module decorator, we have these properties: declarations, imports, providers, and so on. We can also add another property that you haven't seen so far, that is entry components. And we set this to an array. In this array, we register all the components that are added dynamically. So here we need to register edit course component. Now back in the browser, the error is gone. And when we click this button, we get this beautiful dialog. we can click on the overlay and the dialog disappears with an animation. Very nice. Now, let's add 2 buttons here to close this dialog. So let's go to edit course.html. Here I'm going to add a couple of buttons and apply the MD raised button directive on each of them. Let's call the first one yes and the second one no. Now, when the user clicks on any of these buttons, we want the dialog to close automatically. How do we do that? It's very easy. There is another directive for this purpose. So if you look at the documentation for the dialog module, on this page under the API tab, if you scroll down, under directives, you can see the MD dialog close directive. Look at the selector. We can apply this as an attribute to the button element. So here, all we have to do is to apply MD dash dialog dash close. Now, optionally, we can set a value here, and this value will be the result of closing this dialog. So if you want to tell the component that opened this dialog what button the user clicked on, we can set the value here. So we can set this to yes, and then I'm going to duplicate this on the other button and set the value to no. Now, just to let you know, back in the documentation, here on this table, you can see the input properties of this MD dialog close directive. So you can see we have an input property with an alias, which is exactly the same as the selector for this directive. So that's why I've set this property like this here. All right, now let's go back to our app component and read the result. So look at the return type of this open method. The return type of this method is an instance of the MD dialog ref class. Note that this class is generic, and inside this angle brackets, we have the type of generic argument. So here we'll get a dialog reference to edit course component. So let's chain a few method calls here. Once we get this dialog reference, we can call the after closed method. Look at the return type of this after closed method. It returns an observable. With this observable, we can subscribe to it and will be notified when the user closes our dialog box. So we call after closed. Now we have an observable, so we can call the subscribe method. And here we get the result. For now, let's simply display it in the console. Okay, now back in the browser. So I'm going to open the dialog and click the yes button. Now look in the console, and this is the result. Beautiful. So to open a dialog, we use the MD dialog service. We simply call the open method, and optionally, if you want to be notified when the dialog is closed, you can subscribe to the observable that is returned from the after closed method. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to pass data to a dialog.